Hi, and welcome to our featured webinar today, Moving Unisys Workload to AWS, part of Astadia's mainframe modernization series. Today, our expert team from Astadia and Micro Focus will show you how to take your Unisys mainframe workloads to AWS and what mainframe to AWS deployment looks like. Before we start, a few housekeeping items. If you're having trouble viewing the webinar, please click on the help icon located at the bottom right-hand side of your player. Later on in the webinar, you'll have a chance to get your questions answered during our Q&A session. Questions can be submitted at any time throughout the webinar via the questions box located in the lower right of your control panel. We'll try to get to as many questions as we can. Any question not answered during Q&A will be followed up directly after the webinar. We also have a special offer for everyone attending this webinar, and we'll cover the details of this offer right after the Q&A, so be sure to stay until the end. Once again, thank you for joining us. Craig, let's get started.
Great, thanks Jackie, and thanks everybody for joining us today. We are here today to discuss how to move your Unisys workload to AWS. So just I'm going to first run down the agenda very quickly. We're going to go through some introductions of the speakers, and then talk about why you would want to move your Unisys workload to the Amazon AWS environment. The steps to deploy that workload to AWS, and then we're going to give you a live demonstration of a Unisys mainframe application that we've actually migrated to AWS, and show you how that works within AWS. Then, as Jackie mentioned, we'll have some Q&A, and then we're going to give you a snapshot of some upcoming webinars. And then we'll discuss the special offer that Jackie referred to. So let's move on with the agenda. And so my name is Craig Marble. I'm the Senior Director of Legacy Modernization at Astadia. I've been with Astadia for a little over 7 years now. And prior to that, I was 16 years at Micro Focus. And in all, I have 25 plus years of IT experience, and almost all of that has been focused on modernization, and including positions within product management, pre-sales management, and delivery management. So all different aspects of IT and modernization. With me today, I have Ed Airy. Ed Airy is not only a friend, but a former co-worker. Ed Airy is Director of Solutions Marketing at Micro Focus. He's been at Micro Focus for more than 10 years with more than 17 years of IT experience, focused on application access, integration, and modernization. And he also has experience in product management, marketing, pre-sales, and service delivery, and technical services management. So thanks for joining us today, Ed. And last but not least, one of our presenters, our demo king for today, is John Oman. So John Oman is an Astadia employee. In fact, I think he's probably one of the first Astadia employees with more than 27 years at our company, and a whopping 42 years of Unisys experience, and on top of that, 20 years leading Unisys software development, productivity software, things like that, for the Unisys platform. In addition to Unisys, he has experience in IBM mainframes and distributed computing, and of course AWS. So with that, I'll move into just a little bit about who Astadia is. So Astadia is well, we're really a boutique systems integrator, and we focus on maximizing the impact of what we do while minimizing the risk for you and your IT environment, whether it's in the enterprise or in the cloud ecosystem. And clients go with us because of our experience and our agility, and we actually do deliver very good results. So we have three primary, I guess you might say, lines of business. Those are segregated into what we call develop, migrate, and manage. So on the develop side, we help customers design, develop, build, and test and secure software products and capabilities. We do things like testing as a service, provide DevOps consulting, designing and building software. We have a managed group that does managed services, and that is everything from managing your cloud environment to managing your servers in your office, or setting up kiosks in offices for people to take their laptops to have them fixed. So we do all kinds of managed services business. And then the part that we're here to talk about, of course, is the migrate business, and that is taking a look at what you have and what you've invested in over years that still worked really well for you, but maybe could be repurposed to extend the life and leverage that investment into the future. So in that vein, we've got over 90 mainframe migrations under our belt, and that is both Unisys and IBM to distributed platforms on Windows, Linux, and Unix. It's mostly Windows and Linux now, and on premises and within AWS. So we do have experience in this area. And now I'm going to hand it over to Ed to give you an idea of what Micro Focus does. Ed?
Thank you, Craig. I appreciate the introductions and kind words there. A little bit about Micro Focus. We've been working with Astadia for well over 20 years. I think our partnership goes a bit beyond that as well. We are a software company, a software infrastructure company. We're focused on enabling our customers to derive more value from their core business systems. So a core aspect of what we'll be discussing today are business applications that reside on the Unisys platform. We believe at Micro Focus that many organizations have what they need to be competitive today in the market. But the challenge becomes, how do you bridge to the future? How do you prepare for that next opportunity? So our capability, our focus is about enabling them to be able to bridge the old and the new together. That effectively brings us to the discussion around Unisys. Why would you consider moving workload from a Unisys platform to AWS? Well, there's a variety of drivers for this. Many organizations start from a perspective of perhaps cost or total cost of ownership. Maybe there's more an efficient platform in terms of moving that workload and running it day to day. Others are looking perhaps to the future in terms of skills and personnel. Maybe there's folks within the organization that are retiring and they need to look to backfill that talent, but also protect subject matter expertise that's vital to the company. There may be a strategy or concern around capacity, particularly for organizations that have an element of seasonality with respect to the customer demand. Or it could be about integration with back office systems, or particularly new platforms such as .NET and Java. But why would you consider moving workload from Unisys to AWS? Well, another perspective is to look perhaps at the health of Unisys as an organization. And they've seen a lot of change over time. And what I think is probably fairly obvious for some that have been following the organization, and particularly the stock price, you've seen a decline, unfortunately. And as a result of revenues declining, what you typically see is a decline in R&D. So it raises some questions as to what the future will be, what will hold for Unisys. Certainly, what will they do in terms of continued investment? What are the options for customers in terms of development and modernization? So it also creates an opportunity for discussion as to what the potential could be. But we haven't yet answered the question, why cloud? Well, what is driving cloud adoption? Craig, what are your thoughts on that?
Sure. So while all this is going on with Unisys and some questions around how much they're investing in the future and what their revenues will be in the future, we're seeing a continued acceleration of adoption to the cloud. So we're seeing really some incredible growth. So it's estimated that in 2016, about $19 billion was spent by companies for cloud initiatives, and that is expected to rise to $122 billion in 2020, and that's a big increase. Likewise, about 85% of the customers are beyond just the discovery, kicking the tire phase of cloud. They're embracing it, they're moving to it, and they're saying, gosh, what else can we put in the cloud and how fast can we get there? So the acceleration is really, it's a hyper acceleration to get to the cloud. And what we've seen is over I guess you'd say the era of cloud computing is really about three three waves of adoption. So you had the early adoption, which was, okay, let's put our website out there. You know, oh, that worked really well. Let's go ahead and do our development and testing out there. So, you know, maybe if you're a mainframe shop, you want to do your development and testing in the cloud to keep the resources off of your mainframe, and perhaps even delay upgrading your desktop's environment, because you can run a high-powered desktop in the cloud and on a fairly simple desktop machine. And then moving things like CRM and other software as a service packages out into the cloud, expanding it into marketing and big data and processing. And then in the second wave, after that all seemed to work really well, people started looking at it for, I guess, bigger and more critical workloads, things like disaster recovery, right? Disaster recovery as a service, a way to back up your systems. And then people started using the cloud to help facilitate their DevOps. And now we're seeing a third wave where we're really getting to the point where people are saying, you know what, I've got these big applications, and the cloud seems to be working very well for me for my other cloud implementation, so why couldn't I move those other applications in there? And of course, one of the big, I guess, thorns in the side of people who have that strategy is, what do I do with my legacy mainframe apps, right? How do I exploit the cloud, and is it possible? Well, yes, it is possible. We've done it, we've seen it, and it definitely is possible. But the next question is, of course, is AWS ready for mainframe workload, right? There's some concern that, you know, hey, it looks great, but will it really be able to handle all of my work? Well, think of it this way. So in just this past June of 2017, the product catalog of Amazon had over 372 million items. So that in itself is a lot to manage and take care of. They accounted for 43% of all online retail sales and had about 300 million user accounts. So that's a fairly substantial, you might say, customer base, a lot of data to manage. And they have millions of transactions per day. And we're not just talking about what they sell in the e-tail business, but also all the back office work that goes along with it. And so, you know, I was thinking about this a couple of years ago, and I thought, you know what? I have never not been able to buy anything on Amazon. I've never gone to Amazon to buy something and it said, oh, sorry, can't do this now, come back in an hour. It just always worked. And all of this is done without a mainframe in sight. And we're talking about, you know, some very sophisticated calculations happening all the time. So I do think it is ready, especially when you consider that Amazon Web Services is a $12 billion year business in just 2016, and that is growing, has over a million users right now, and in 2015, that was 2 years ago, could handle over 1 million transactions per second. So it is an awesome platform, and it is ready for mainframe workload. I don't think that there's any doubt about whether you're running it on a distributed platform in your own data center or you're running it in the cloud, it will work. So, of course, that begs the question of how is it done? So how do I get my Unisys mainframe workload migrated and redistributed over into the Amazon Web Services environment? Well, that's where we can give you a lot of great advice, along with some support and products from Micro Focus to do just that. So we have, as I mentioned, been doing mainframe migrations for a long time. We did our first back in the very early 90s. So we have built a deployment process, a methodology, a roadmap methodology, what we call it, that is based on, you know, all of those experiences of the mainframes that we've migrated. And we've boiled it down to some pretty basic fundamental steps. So in any project like this, the first thing we do is run through a discovery phase where we get all the source code, all the data, all the software, the processes, and the requirements, what the customer needs, and feed that information into what we call our transformation engine rules. It's a rules-based engine that we use to modify the code for the target platform. So along with that, we start doing some analysis on that code using Micro Focus tools and some of our own tools, and we start building the architecture for the AWS environment, the databases, the interfaces, the customizations, and planning everything that needs to happen and when it needs to happen in order to migrate this application and all of its pieces into the AWS environment. What pieces will move over, what pieces need to be replaced, things of that nature. All of this is, again, fed into the transformation engine, and we run through the legacy code through our filtering system that is based on this transformation engine and modifies all the code. It's really an iterative process that is automated, but also has some human intervention involved that makes it possible for us to do this in a way that has a good return on investment. So that is really what happens in the modernization stage. We actually run the code through the filter. We take a look at the data, the static data, what can be moved over early, what's dynamic and needs to be migrated at the last minute, what application components need to be in place before we go live and start setting things up. We move into the test phase where we start testing everything that we've migrated in our sandbox environment. Do performance testing and load balance testing. We decide whether this can all run under one EC2 instance, or maybe you need several Amazon Compute instances running the same application to handle the workload under the Elastic Load Balancer. And then once we've got this all figured out, we begin our implementation process, and that is putting everything into place. That's all the code, all the supporting pieces. Maybe you've got a scheduler. Maybe you've got some type of sorting tool that you need to do sorting. So all of this gets put into place. We have a cutover, and then once cutover is complete, we can do one of two things. We can get your folks boned up on how we did it and what's out there, and get them to the point where they can maintain it going forward, or we can manage the whole thing for you post-implementation. It really just depends on what the client wants. And we find that this works really well for us. It's worked for us at least 90 times. So that's a pretty good track record. So if we take a look at how that looks from an architectural standpoint, if you look at your general sort of high-level Burroughs or ClearPath Unisys mainframe environment, you've got your usual suspects, the ClearPath environment, hardware, MCP sits on top of their the operating system, and then you've got sort of the core application pieces up top, and that's your batch environment, the comms online environment, and then the various languages that you might be running in that environment: COBOL, XGen, Algol, Link, Wiffle, etc. And then of course you've got your database, DMS2, and then sequential files, all within that sort of mainframe framework, application framework. And then, of course, accessing that is done through T27 screens or some type of custom user interface that uses the T27 protocol through the web or something like that. And then, of course, you have the supporting pieces such as your scheduler and your printing and versioning and security and so on. So what we did was develop a reference architecture for getting that into the AWS environment. So if we take a look at the AWS environment, you'll see the big orange box there. That represents just AWS as a whole. The box inside of that is your virtual private cloud. That's kind of like your private sandbox area within the AWS cloud environment. Within there, you have, in this case, I've got it set up as a single EC2 instance. So you've got a single EC2 instance. That is this big box right here in the middle. And it has what we call the mainframe cloud framework. And so this is where the batch from the Unisys mainframe environment comes down and moves into the mainframe cloud framework on the AWS environment. So you're running OpenMCS, which is our proven transaction monitor for Unisys environments. It's been in use since the 90s. And the batch COBOL comes down just as COBOL. The data sequential files come down as sequential files. Over to the right, you see there's RDS and then within RDS you have multiple options. You can run under AWS Aurora, which is what we've done, or you could use SQL Server or Oracle or some other database product. The catch here is that, of course, the DMS2 database is hierarchical in nature, whereas the other databases are relational. So there is a conversion that needs to happen there, which is something we're very familiar with. And then also, if you have perhaps you want to augment this legacy application, and within the same EC2, you could put in some C programs, some C# programs, or maybe you've got some PowerShell scripts you want to put in there, and then all of that is supported, of course, by again, the scheduling and the printing and reporting and security and things like that. All of that is accessed exactly the way it was before, using your T27 screens, custom user interfaces or web interfaces. All they're doing is pointing to a different place. So very low impact on the end user. And then all of this is supported from a development perspective using things like Code Commit and CloudWatch. Those are versioning and monitoring tools. And then, of course, for performance, if you're running multiple instances of your application, you've got the ELB, which is the Elastic Load Balancer. LDAP is just for identity management. And then EBS is kind of like, you can think of that as the hard drive of your server. So your EC2 instance has the hard drive, and that is really the EBS aspect of it. So this is a high-level look at migrating from a Unisys Burroughs to AWS. So the Sperry side, the Dorado side, is very, very similar. You have the same sort of components at the top. You've got your batch components. You've got TIP instead of comms, and you maybe have DMS and RDMS instead of just DMS2. And there are some other software products that are sort of unique to the Sperry environment, meaning for example, BIS or Mapper. And of course, the operating system is different. You've got OS 2200 instead of the MCP operating system. And then accessing is done through UTS screens, which is the Sperry version of that sort of comms protocol. But everything else pretty much remains the same, including, you'll notice, the target environment on the bottom is really the same as it was for the Burroughs side of the house, because all the pieces map to the same pieces in the AWS environment. So your batch runs like it always does, the COBOL comes down, and then you have OpenMCS, which is, again, our transaction monitor for Unisys that will take on that work. And everything else remains the same, so I won't go over all of that in any more detail. Now, perhaps you've got an environment that is just really big. You've got a really big mainframe footprint, and it's not feasible for you to move everything over at one time. You need to take sort of a phased approach. Well, we can support that. You can use AWS product called Direct to Connect to give you a connection to your mainframe environment, whether it's on your premises or in a data center somewhere, and work cooperatively with the migrated apps within the AWS environment. So you don't have to do everything in one big swoop. You can move things over a bit at a time. It really just depends on your own personal situation. So I want to show you now just a high-level mapping of the Unisys products or pieces and what their target is within AWS. So the MCP and the OS 2200 operating systems would go within AWS as a Windows, Linux, or Unix. Usually it's Windows or Linux. The comms and TIP environment is replaced by the Astadia OpenMCS environment. The COBOL and the XGen. XGen is also an Astadia product that was built back in the 80s. It's a COBOL generator for the Burroughs line. but that all moves over to the AWS environment. So the COBOL would go to COBOL, the XGen would go to XGen, remain XGen. The ALGOL and the MASM, that always gets converted, and we recommend converting that to COBOL just because it seems rational to keep it in the primary language, which generally is COBOL. But it can be rewritten into some other language as well, like C# or Java, or it could be that the ALGOL and the MASM were performing some type of standardized function that is handled by the target operating system. So you may be able to map some of those functions and not actually have to rewrite any code, but just use some sort of OS command. So you've got your link and your mapper, also known as AB Suite and Biz. Those would generally come over as C# or Java. The WIFLs and the ECLs would be converted to VBScript or PowerShell or some other scripting language of your choice. And then you have the data, which is the different database products, DMS, DMS2, RDMS, and then, of course, flat files. And all of those, the databases would move over into either Aurora or some of the other relational products out there. That, of course, does mean that hierarchical data needs to be converted into relational data. It sounds like a big project. It's a challenge, but it can be done. We've done it many times successfully, so it's not insurmountable, and it's not really as hard as it seems. And then flat files, you can keep them as flat files if you'd like, or a lot of times we recommend moving those into a relational environment only because it makes it easier to share that data outside of the legacy application, and a lot of times that's a big advantage. So some of the software that we use on the execution side, Stadia software, is OpenMCS, which, as I mentioned, runs like a transaction monitor for Unisys applications. It runs on Windows, Linux, and Unix. It is a scalable replacement for columns or TIP. It is proven in use around the globe today, and we have actually put enhancements into it to support the AWS environment specifically. We also, if you have XGen today, that XGen code and product will port over just like you do today. It is a 4GL, for those of you who don't know, that generates COBOL for Unisys, but we also now generate for IBM and Micro Focus. It's got over 100 million lines of code in production today, and it's the same sort of benefits there of speeding development and improving quality. I'm going to hand it over to Ed now to talk about the Micro Focus software that we use in our AWS migration projects, including the one that we're going to show you here in just a few minutes.
All right, thank you, Craig. Yes, so let's start with the first piece of software here, the first solution, which is around application analysis. So as you see here, the tool set is referred to as Enterprise Analyzer, and this is about getting better understanding into your inventory. As Craig went through just a moment ago, there are a lot of moving pieces when you're looking at modernizing and moving workload from a Unisys environment to AWS. So it's important to start from the position of understanding what you have, and then of course what you don't. So you can go find those missing items or develop a plan to be able to fill the gap. So this is as important as understanding the inventory. It's equally important to understand the relationships within your code. So the following screen here is going to show you a very complex diagram. I mean, this is part of the power of the tool set, is it gives you the ability to quickly understand and visualize the relationships that take place within your application. But as Craig sort of parses through the animations here on this slide, what you'll see is it also has the ability to filter the view. So on the following screen, it'll show you a condensed view, or perhaps a more specific view into the applications or modules that are important to you. You can drill down even further. As this animation builds, you can drill down even further into the specific program in question. You can identify the relationships that may be of interest or where you need to research a bit further. It gives you a variety of different insights into how the application is structured, perhaps the most common business rules that are leveraged that you want to be able to maximize or maybe modernize in some way. But again, it gives you better understanding to make smarter decisions as you go forward. Now, the other piece that's equally important is the connection between this tool set and the development tools, which we'll talk about in a moment. There's a relationship there that allows you to be able to take the programs that you identify for change and take action on them within the tool set that we'll discuss in a moment. What you see here in front of you now is a set of views, dashboards, if you will. So think of it as a repository. You get instant access to the code repository. So again, Enterprise Analyzer is a static code analysis tool, so it allows you to analyze the code at rest. There's a variety of different tools and programs and modules that allow you to do so, but then also just from an at-a-glance perspective, it gives you some great views, some great charts. So as I mentioned, the tool set allows you to effectively work with the code, get a better understanding of the code, but then plan to take action on that code using the development tools. And that brings us to the conversation around Visual COBOL. So this is the tool set that allows you to edit, compile, debug, and test that Unisys, those Unisys applications written in COBOL. And you can do so using an IDE that you're familiar with, either Eclipse or Visual Studio. Again, tool sets that most developers will know and be familiar with. Again, particularly important if you think back to the point we mentioned a bit earlier in our webinar around planning for the future talent, and being able to capture, ensure that you capture SME expertise. There's also the element of portability. The element of portability comes into play here because, again, under AWS, you have some choices as to how you deploy the code. You could deploy the code as is, as native code, as Craig has mentioned. You also have the option with Visual COBOL to compile your COBOL application, your programs, to Java bytecode. So depending on the level of integration you need within your application portfolio and what your target goals are, there's lots of flexibility here and interoperability to be able to enable you to go to the cloud and then also modernize beyond just that point. So that's a quick review of some of the development and analysis tools that enable you to move that workload. I think, Craig, now we have a demonstration planned.
That's right. Yes, thanks, Ed. Thanks for going over that. So we are going to now run through an application that we use in-house. It's actually a live, real-world application that was used to track trouble tickets for our software. It's an application that we run on our mainframe today to track issues when people call in for support. Not just problems, but help and assistance. And to do that today is going to be John Ohman. John Ohman, as I mentioned, has a lot of experience in Unisys. Over 40 years of experience in Unisys was a key component in migrating this application into AWS. So John, I'll hand it over to you to show us and walk us through what we're looking at here.
Thank you, Craig. Hello, everybody. Hopefully I'll put some meat to all this sales talk you've been listening to. Like Craig said, we have a system we wrote years ago to track customers, to track calls, to track issues with our software. It actually reports into our source control system as to which problems are fixed based on which patches. Anyway, this currently runs on the mainframe. Parts of it still runs there, not all of it. But anyway, I will log into our mainframe. If anybody is familiar with, this is our LX machine. And this is the mark screen that you typically get. And a window into the online environment. So this is our what we call our tracking system. And here I'm just going to do a quick update just to prove that it still works. Go into customer maintenance. I'm going to put in a tran code of add customer. Add a little bit of information. and we will add a customer. Going back to the menu, we would get a phone call, we'd go into add call, we'd type in our customer name, who's calling, we basically, I'm going to put Kathy in here as calling, and transmit to add phone call, and phone call added, and put my name in here, and we go to our add call, and here's our new call that we have. I can check it, and then come down and add a description, and there's our call. Anyway, that is our tracking system as it runs today on the mainframe. So we take the mainframe application and we take it down to the Windows environment, and here is our Visual Studio project that we have. We take the database Dazzle, which is a picture here. Everybody that's on Unisys knows what a Dazzle looks like. We take that and we process that through our tools, and we come out with our DDL. And we target the different databases, like Craig said. This one's targeting the Aurora database, which is very similar to MySQL and SQL Server. So that's the database DDL, and so we take the Dazzle, convert it to DDL, load it in, and use that in our tools to convert to software, convert to programs. Datacom, we take a C file, which on the MCP side is the comms configuration file that shows all the Windows programs, all the things that are involved with the online environment, and we'll convert that to a config file that's imported into our MCS. It's just a XML file that's imported into the MCS. So with the automatic conversion of these tools, we then can take online programs or batch programs and run them through our tools, bring them into the SQL Server, and you can compile your whole project or compile an individual module. You can even run individual programs using their really cool debugger. I can actually step into this, go into the list customer program, and so now I'm stepping through the program, seeing lines of code execute. I can zoom and query values. I just connected to the database, and if I hover over a field, it tells me the values in there, the picture. I can go see it in working storage. Everything you wanted to know about the program as it executes. I'll go ahead and terminate that. And we also bring into our environment, I mentioned the online programs, but if you have screens, whether it's an SDF or in the program or wherever it's located on the mainframe, we will import it into our tools, and you can use the tools to edit and maintain your screens. So that is a quick overview of the Micro Focus environment running in Visual Studio. It's very easy to use once you learn where everything's at. We take the code, and we're going to talk about AWS now. AWS is the basically the environment they created for us to maintain this environment. It's fairly new to us, but it's been fairly easy to get to know and very interesting. I'm going to take you into what Craig mentioned, EC2. That stands for Elastic Cloud Computing. We got a lot of acronyms, so I'm not going to try to lose you with what they are. Anyway, in our region that we have, we're running the U.S. East region out of Virginia. We have 15 instances running and I'm showing you just the legacy modernization instances. The one that I'm using for this demo is this first one, so I'll click on it. Shows me all sorts of good information down here, the IP, a few other things. It also shows me the instance type. Now this is the real power that I found with AWS. And let me show you the different instance types that they have. The T2 Medium is what I'm running, which is a 2 CPU, 4 gigabytes of memory processor and memory. But from there you can go to the large, extra large, T2 extra large, 8 processor, 32. Then you can go to the M4 series, which is meant for the larger machines. You can go all the way up to a 64 CPU with as much memory as you need. And then you go to the M3 series, and then you have several other levels of system that you can switch your environment to. And really, it's as easy as right-clicking. I'm not going to actually do it because it takes about 5 minutes or so. I can actually stop the process, go into instance settings, change instant type, and then come back and do a start here. And again, within 5 minutes, I could have from my T2 Medium to a M4 2 extra large machine with lots of power running the same instance of the machine that I have saved off.
So it'd be pretty much like moving it onto a whole other machine that had a lot more power.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's pretty cool.
This is our this is that instance I just showed you. I'll go back real quick. This LegMod instance. Let me get rid of that. This demo here is actually running, and this is the login for it. So this is logged in to that instance. So if I bring up our MCS, our web MCS interfaces to the MCS, what you have here is I have basically 4 MCSs that I can interact with. The one I'm going to use for the demo is the second one, but of importance here is the third one. This is the ELB for AWS. Notice there's no details out here. Going back to AWS with a little more of the tour, if I go into what they call the auto scaling group, I can generate a load balancing machine that, in this case, has minimum of 0 running, and it maxes up to 12. So I can actually go in here, and I'm going to do this. I'm going to change this to have 2 minimum running. Save it. And that's going to bring up other instances of the basically a copy of my base machine that I've captured. It'll bring up 2 instances that now when I connect to the load balancer, it will share my connections with the different machines. As the load of those machines get to a certain threshold that I previously has set up, it'll fire off another copy of the machine, and it'll fire up, in this case, up to 12 machines sharing the workload. And like I said, our WebMCS actually interfaces to that, and it will come up here in a minute. I'm not going to worry about it at the moment. But it will interface to those 2 machines. Now, I'm not going to use those for the demo today, just to show you some of the power of the AWS. Also of note, whenever there are many hooks in these instances that are running, and we use those hooks to get information out of it. So when a machine shuts down, it actually fires off a copy into the S3 buckets, which is a storage bucket that we can use. So it fires off our logs so we can capture them out of that environment. So if you're running something that generated a report in a certain directory, and when that machine shuts down, it could actually copy it to the S3 bucket, and you would have you're able to capture that information. Also running is the the RDS. The RDS is the Relational Database machine, and you can set that also at its own level. So you have, we're running a R3 2 extra large database machine. So you can set your level of database machine also fairly easily by just shutting it down, setting the class type, and starting it back up, and you have your same database either running at a higher, faster machine, or maybe at a slower, more cost-efficient machine. It's your choice whether you scale it up or down. So anyway, as you see now, the Elastic Load Balancer is now bringing up 2 machines that our MCS, our web MCS, is reporting on. It's still working on this one, but anyway, the one we're going to use for testing, there it goes. And it also, we tell you what the percent of the CPU is, which is also information that you can get out of the CloudWatch software, which we've set up for us in our environment. CloudWatch, you can pre-set up CPU utilization or whatever bits of information that you want to track throughout the day. If you want to track only one particular one, you can just select one. Notice ours jumped here the last few minutes. So there's quite a bit of power here in the CloudWatch. Or if you wanted to get to a specific machine, you can monitor a machine and look at all the charts and information for that particular machine. So there is more information than you can possibly use, but it is very interesting to look through and read. Anyway, back to our little demo here, we're going to start up our T27, and it's logging into our MCS, and it brings up the same machine. It is different that it shows we put the host name here. So it shows the same, basically the same screen, and the same updates can happen. I can go up and do a add customer of test. Anyway, so we added a customer. We go back to the menu, we add a call. And we put in a short description. And back here in our list of open calls, I have our description for AWS. So a summary of what we've just seen now is we've taken a system out of the Unisys mainframe. We've shown you what we did in Studio and our tools to convert it, the database, the datacom, the onlines, the batch, so it would run in the AWS environment. I showed you the AWS environment running the environment that we had on the mainframe. If I click on this, you can see the programs that are running. Particular program, just a little features of our MCS is that you do have maximum number of programs is whatever you want it to be. We have one copy running, timeouts, everything's there. The queue information, how many, we've removed 10 transactions from the queue. Total CPU for all those is 0.18 seconds. So we've shown you the MCS running, we've shown you onlines running against both environments. Basically the same information, the same screens. The only thing the user has to learn is how to click on a different icon to get to the new machine versus the old machine. The screens can look exactly the same, and there's no learning curve for the users. Anyway, that basically concludes the demo. Back to you, Craig.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, a couple of comments. You know, I think some people who aren't familiar with what's going on here would say it looks the way it did before, and my response to that is, yeah, that's exactly what's supposed to happen. You know, best practices dictate that you want to move the application over from one platform to another. You want it to look and work exactly the way it did on the target platform as it did on the source platform. So you generally want it to look and run exactly the way it did. So you're going to see an application that runs in AWS just like it did on the mainframe, and you know, it's an incredible feat to be able to do that. Then once it's migrated, of course, then you reduce your expenses, and then you can focus on replacing the interface or doing some other types of integration with other applications. That kind of stuff you can do after the actual migration has taken place. But thanks, John. I appreciate it. I think it looks really good. So Jackie, I think we are. I'm going to take control back over, and I think we are ready to move into the Q&A portion. Do you have any questions that have come in?
Yeah, thanks, Craig. We have had a few questions come in already, so I just want to remind everyone that they can continue to submit questions using the questions pane located in the lower right corner of the control panel. And I do realize we're running up against the hour in a little bit, so if we don't get to your question during this time, we'll follow up directly after the webinar. So the first question that I have that's come through is, it reads, don't you have to change a lot of source code to get Unisys applications working in AWS?
Yes, I'll take that. So it depends on how the composition of your Unisys application. So if you've got a Unisys application that has a lot of COBOL and some assembler, some Algol or MASM, then the COBOL actually moves over very nicely. As I mentioned before, and I had the graphic up that showed the mappings, MASM and Algol, we typically rewrite it as something else. Now, depending on the functions that are being performed, it could be just functions that can be replaced by the OS, or it may be something that can be done in COBOL. But generally speaking, the COBOL comes over very well. You do have to make some changes. Now, those changes focus on a pretty narrow set of things, and that is, of course, your database access. You're not going to be accessing a DMS2 database on the mainframe anymore. You're going to be accessing a distributed database, a relational database in a distributed environment in AWS. So you're going to need to modify the source code to take that into account. There are also some analysis that needs to be done around sorting, because of course on the mainframe you're working in an FTDIC environment, and on the distributed side you're most likely, not always, but most likely working in an ASCII environment, and that can impact how you do sorts. So you want to look at that logic and see if there's any changes that need to be made around that. But there is not a lot of code changes that need to happen. And for the code changes that do happen, that's where our filters come in. So we have a series of knowledge-based, rules-based transformation filters that will transform that code automatically. So in other words, we identify what changes need to be made throughout the application, and we filter that code to make those changes automatically. So there are some code changes that need to occur, yes, but it depends on the composition of the source application and what it's made out of.
Okay, great. Another question that has just come in, are there best practices available on moving workload to AWS? So
we do have a paper that talks about moving Unisys to an AWS environment, and it speaks to some degree on the best practices around that. So yes, there are a series of a set of best practices that we employ. So some of that at a high level is, of course, we always take a least change, least risk approach. So we recommend if the code can be ported over, then you port it over, unless there's some real reason not to. So, you know, let's say, for example, you've got some COBOL. It may not be a huge application, but it would take more to rewrite it into something else than it would be to port it over. So we always take that least change, least risk approach. We also try to not mess with the user interface in this particular phase because it's easier to debug on the target environment if you're working with the same user interface. They should behave the same way. And if there are some differences in how they behave, it's much easier to say, okay, this is an expected change in behavior. So least change, again, least change, and which of course means least risk. So there are some best practices, and we can go over those in more detail with prospects when they contact us.
Okay, I think we have time for just one more before we get to the end of our time. What's the most difficult part of a project like this?
You know, again, it depends on the project, but I will say the one thing that has bubbled up in all of these projects is due to the fact that we are generally working with systems that are sometimes 20, 30, maybe even 40 years old. They've been working for a long time, and they've been working pretty well. And throughout that time, the documentation and the sort of test scripts that go along with those applications tend to disappear. Because a lot of times you've got, again, they're stable applications, they're working well, and you have a developer and they'll make a change and they'll know how to test it. So they don't need some formal documentation telling them how to do it. So when you do a project like this, the good news is that you don't have to test every single line of code, right? Because it's not a brand new system. You're taking proven code and you're moving it to another platform. So there are areas that you know to focus on, as I mentioned before, things around sorting, things around data access, things like that. So those are the areas that you focus your testing on. The bad news is that a lot of times those test scripts just don't exist, which means that you can have a significant effort around the testing of the application. So in some cases you'll need to develop test scripts. In some cases, you may have old test scripts that you just need to update. But we generally find that the technology, like doing the actual migration, is the easy part. It is the validation and the testing that becomes really the big burden. So that would be my answer to that. So I think you're ready to move on. I think we're just about out of time. So I just have a couple more things we want to cover with you. If you want some more information on this whole webinar is based on a paper we've got called the Unisys to AWS Reference Architecture paper. It can be found on our website under the Cloud GPS area. If you can remember that really long URL at the bottom, it'll take you right to it. And then we do have some upcoming webinars on the 16th of November, so just about a month from today. We'll also be covering how to migrate Unisys mainframe workload to Azure. Azure, as you know, is another leading cloud provider. So we also have a reference architecture around the Azure platform. We also will be doing IBM mainframe migrations, reference architectures, webinars to AWS and to Azure. Those will be announced and not on here yet, but we have been doing some benchmark timings in AWS, and we'll be having some webinars around that as well. So stay tuned for that. And then we actually are ready now to talk about our special offer, and for that we'll hand it over to Ed.
All right, thank you, Craig. Absolutely. Let's talk about the value profile assessment. So this is an opportunity for everyone that's joined us here today to talk, to sit down with the Stadia and Micro Focus experts and get a better understanding of your application portfolio, but then also build a roadmap for the future. So what this assessment, what this offer is about is really trying to get a better understanding of your goals today, particularly as it pertains to Unisys application workload. Hopefully moving to AWS is of interest to you. We'd like to talk about what that means. But it first starts with an understanding of your application and inventory and, of course, your goals. So as we review your business goals, we understand your technical architecture. We also take a look at your path to the future, what you'd like to achieve, not only moving to AWS, but perhaps beyond that in terms of modernization. So we'll sit down, we'll help build that roadmap with some recommendations as to how to get there, using much of the technology that you've seen here today, along with many of the best practices that Craig has referenced up to this point, and effectively build you a plan. This is a complimentary offering that, again, is delivered in partnership with Stadia and Micro Focus. If you're interested in learning more or signing up for one of these value profile assessments, you can learn more by reaching out to us at info@stadia.com. So we look forward to engaging with you and discussing how you can take the next steps to moving to AWS.
Great.
With that, Greg, I'll turn it over to you.
Yep. So Jackie, I think we're at the conclusion. If you have some wrap up.
Yeah, thanks, guys. We are definitely out of time, and I want to thank everyone for sticking through to the end. And we hope to see you next on our next webinar, Unisys to Azure. Thanks. Have a great day.
Thank you.